If you go by the headlines, you'd think we have a big problem with voter fraud in this country. We don't. But don't take my word for it. The Brennan Center for Justice at the NYU School of Law has been studying this issue for years. And you know what they found? An American is more likely to be struck by lightning than impersonating another voter at the polls. They found rates of fraud to be between 0.0003% and 0.0025%. Hey, even former President Trump's own Attorney General, Bill Barr, agrees. Here's what he told NBC's Lester Holt.
And I told him that all this stuff was bullshit and about election fraud.
And while most of the new voting laws that passed in places like Texas, Georgia, and Florida focused on new voting restrictions, some actually expanded the right to vote.
So at Voting Rights Lab, one of the most important things that we do is we keep an eye out on all 50 states with regard to voting policy. Facing the pandemic, our local election administrators and election officials across the states really did tremendous work to make sure that Americans could still participate fully in our democracy. And as a result of that, we saw many states revisit their laws in 2021. In some cases, they worked to make the laws, unfortunately, more stringent for American voters. But what's really important is despite all the headlines and despite the serious setbacks that many voters are facing in their states, many states took great action on behalf of voters. In fact, 70 million eligible American voters are living in a state that improved their election laws in 2021. And so that means that voters this fall and this spring are going to have greater access to the ballot.
Curious to see how your state stacks up? Check out this map by my coworker, NBCLX storyteller Peter Holt. It ranks states by the level of their ballot accessibility. The red states like Mississippi, Wyoming, and New Hampshire are considered the least accessible because they have stricter policies when it comes to voting. That means photo IDs are required to vote. There's little to no opportunity for early voting, and there's no online voter registration. Now I'm going to pause just for a second to talk about that photo ID. That requirement is actually pretty popular among both Democrats and Republicans, but government IDs require time and money to obtain. So requiring one to vote just further disenfranchises the poor and marginalized who neither have the time nor money to get one. Now the green states like Illinois, New York, and Minnesota are considered more accessible. That's because they have legislation like this.
32 states have introduced expansive legislation, and that legislation covers things like automatic voter registration, ensuring that if you interact with the Department of Motor Vehicles or another state-based agency, then you can automatically register to vote. Some other legislation, good legislation that has been introduced is around mail voting.
There are also laws that expanded early voting opportunities. Some restored voting rights for people with felony convictions. Others allowed for same-day voting registration. And 13 states are even allowing people to go back and fix their ballot if they made a mistake.
The other thing that I think is really important to note is we actually really saw a polarization in, a group of states moving in the right direction for voters and a group of states really moving in the wrong direction when it comes to access for voters. And what this creates is a fault line in our democracy where your ability as an equal citizen to participate in our democracy is actually very unequal because it depends on where you happen to live.
In total, the Voting Rights Lab tracked almost 3,000 elections-related bills in the 2021 legislative session. Only 301 of them are now law. Of those bills, 117 of them improved voter access, while 47 of them restricted it. The remaining bills were considered neutral or mixed. Now, all of that is just happening on the state level, but there are 2 elections-related bills pending in Congress, and those are going to stay there for a while because they're facing opposition from Republican lawmakers.
The most important, I think, is the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which is a piece of legislation that fixes and responds to the Supreme Court decisions in Shelby County.
For context, the SCOTUS decision in Shelby County v. Holder rolled back key provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which outlawed discriminatory voting practices. That happened in 2013. This year's SCOTUS decision regarding Brnovich v. DNC further weakened the law's protections against voting discrimination. So the implementation of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is on the minds of a lot of voting rights advocates because it would restore and strengthen the original Voting Rights Act. Now that second bill, the Freedom to Vote Act, sounds as straightforward as it is. Its goal is to remove the major barriers of voting and create federal voting standards to ensure that everyone has a universal voting experience. So the elections process that I have in Illinois is the exact same as someone's in Texas, Rhode Island, or Nevada. Because at the end of the day, voting itself shouldn't be a partisan issue, but simply the method we use to strengthen our democracy.